eternally. For those of you who don't know, Ken is an oceanographer, poet and linguist. He has 2 doctorates, one which was awarded for research on the tides of the Tamar estuary and the other on the historical phonology of Cornish language. He's noted as being the deviser of Canoic Cemen, an orthography, the way of writing Cornish language, which is based more on the Cornish Middle English phonology than the unified Cornish spelling system that came before this. He's actually published over 80 items relating to Celtic linguistics, including several dictionaries of Cornish. Are you responsible for the one that's online, Ken? That we can access the searching one? No. Okay.
Explain everything.
Oh, okay, thank you. He's translated numerous hymns and songs into Cornish, some of which I think we'll be hearing later on, and also the lyrics of, I'm sorry, I don't speak any German, so this is probably terrible, Die Zauberflirt. He's composed a substantial amount of poetry in Cornish originally, and a full-length play. I can't say this either. What's it called, Ken?
It's called Juventus Christi.
Flocholeth Christ.
Flocholeth Christ in Cornish.
Okay, thank you. In the style of the Ordinalia, the old Cornish plays. His bardic name is Profus
Morti.
Okay, thank you for that as well. Reflects one of his research interests in oceanography, the other being numeric modelling. He has over 50 publications in oceanography, including the textbook Tides for Marine Studies, just sold over 1,000 copies, so well done with that. Ken speaks Breton and French fluently, as well as English and Cornish, and he's the chairman of the Cornish Language Board, and you're responsible for the academic side of the Cornish...
The research panel of the Academy. Yeah.
The research panel of the Academy as well, yeah. So since taking early retirement from his post as Principal Lecturer in Ocean Science at the University of Plymouth, he's added Scottish country dancing and Japanese to his list of interests, and it also includes orienteering, singing, sailing and walking, so he's very active, and we're very, very happy to have you with us today. So please give a warm margin welcome to our speakers.
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for inviting me again. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I have a more varied audience than I thought I would have. Originally, or when I've done this before, I think I've done it 3 times before, it consisted largely of Marjon students. And clearly I was aiming the lecture at them. And indeed the last time which I gave it, which was not here, I've given this lecture several times, last year I gave it to a first year set of students in Sophia University in Tokyo, which was very interesting to have that, A, to have that large number of students, and B, to do it in Japan. And they asked me a lot of interesting questions, and I'm sure you will as well. So the subject is the fall and rise of the Cornish languages. Interesting language because it is one of very few languages which practically died out and then were revived. The classic example, of course, is Hebrew, which has had considerably more success than Cornish because it's had a lot more behind it. So let's look at Cornish, see what it is, and proceed. This is the overview of the talk. We start off with Cornish as an Indo-European language. We look at the texts, which date from about 1200 to about 1800, why the language declined. We look at place names, because place names are one area where people get interested in Cornish. They see place names in Cornwall, they think, why are these different from those in England? I talk a little about the linguistic features of Cornish, and then come on to the revival, and finally look at the state of the language today. So Indo-European is a set or a family of languages, and the idea that most of the languages in Europe, with certain notable exceptions like Basque, are all related was first proposed in the mid-19th century by German linguists. And here we have an example showing how they are related, showing the families here on the left, and the three which we're perhaps most concerned with are firstly the green one here, which are Germanic and include at the bottom English, and all these others are from in the Germanic family, and we can compare that with those which came from Latin, which are in the Italic family, and all these French, Spanish, Catalan, Portuguese and the like came from Latin, and the Celtic languages form a group by themselves, Celtic, and there are two branches, the Q Celtic and P Celtic, and the ones which are still going are Manx, Scots, Gaelic and Irish form the Q Celtic branch. They are very similar, they are nearly mutually intelligible, and we also have Welsh, Cornish and Breton, which are the P Celtic branch. They are rather different from the Q Celtic, but they're fairly close one to the other. Cornish is closest to Breton, it's a little further away from Welsh. This is the only slide that's on its side. I'm sorry about that. It's because I'm using a PDF rather than PowerPoint. But you can see here at the bottom a map of the British Isles showing the locations of the 6 Celtic countries, including on the continent here, Brittany. And rather more interestingly, I'll read it here, how many people speak these languages. Scots Gaelic is spoken by, this is the 2011 census, 57,000 speakers, which is about 1% of Scotland's population only. Manx, spoken by 1,650 speakers. Yeah. Irish Gaelic, 94,000, which is only 1.5% of the population of Ireland, quite small. Welsh is by far the strongest, over 500,000 Welsh speakers, nearly 20%. And they want to build that up to 50% by 2050. Breton has 210,000 in 2007. I should imagine there'll be fewer now because most of them are aged. 6.7% of the population. And Cornish, we don't know. We don't know how many people speak Cornish because the office of the Census Office has refused consistently to put the question on the census paper, do you speak Cornish? They have plenty of space to do this because the census paper for what they consider as England is the same as that for Wales, except that the Welsh have one question, or perhaps more than one, do you speak Welsh? And that does not appear for the census for England and Cornwall, but there's space for it. And we have been pressing that they make space for the census in 2021. Because it's interesting, because Cornish is a language which has been revived, there's very little evidence scientifically as to how these languages increase in number of speakers. I know that Cornish the number of Cornish speakers is increasing. When I first learned Cornish about 40 years ago, I knew every Cornish speaker. I don't now. There are people in this room who speak Cornish whom I don't know. It is a great pleasure to me to meet Cornish speakers that I don't know. So the number is increasing. What it is, I don't know. A few hundred who speak it fluently, a few thousand who have some knowledge of it. Now, where do these languages come from? Well, if we can trace the Brittonic languages, Welsh, Cornish and Breton, back to a common ancestor, which is called British. And this was the language which was spoken by most of the population in Britain when the Romans invaded. And it had dialects. It had a north dialect and a south dialect. And the northern dialect, here, marked here, split into two languages. Cumbric, which was spoken in the Lake District, that died out in about 1100 AD, and Welsh, Old Welsh here. Now Welsh, of course, is still going and very strong compared to the other languages, but I have two lines here indicating two conventional dialects of Welsh, North Welsh and South Welsh. And the Welsh often used to joke and say that the North could not understand the South, but since the advent of the Welsh television channel, S4C, each gets much more exposure to the other dialect, and they realise that they are certainly mutually intelligible. The other branch consists of Cornish and Breton, which are, as I've said, closer. And we split all these languages into phases: Old, Middle, and Modern. So we have Old Breton, Middle Breton, and Modern Breton. Modern Breton conventionally has 4 dialects, and 3 of them here are mutually intelligible, whereas the 4th one is rather more difficult to understand if you know one of the first 3. It takes quite a while for your ear to become accustomed to the 4th dialect here if you know one of these 3. Now Cornish, of course, is different because it did die out practically and has been revived. And it died out in about 1800, and so we tend to use the term late Cornish. Late in the sense that it was not early, and late in the sense that it's dead. And the revived language was, at least originally, based mainly on Middle Cornish rather than carrying on from Late Cornish. And the reasons for that are there is much more literature, and Cornish was much more alive and vibrant in the Middle Ages. So the revived Cornish, starting in about conventionally 1904, was based largely on Middle Cornish. Not everyone, of course, is in agreement with that idea. Some much prefer a form based on later Cornish, and I can come back to that later. So, what is left of the traditional language in terms of texts? Well, the time is split into 3 phases. Old Cornish, of which there is very little. There are lists of names. These names were recorded in a Bible in Bodmin. People often used to record important things in Bibles because they were chained in churches and they would not get lost. And the lists of the names are manumissions of slaves. And we find that the slaves nearly all had Celtic names, and the masters nearly all had Anglo-Saxon names. I shall not pursue that. There is also a Cornish Latin word list dating from about 1200 AD. It contains nearly 1,000 words, and they are arranged schematically, starting off with religious terms, first to God Almighty, for example, and then going on. There's a section on parts of the body, there's a section on weather, there's a section on crops, there's a section, and so on. And the Cornish words are given a Latin translation. So provided we know what the Latin means, we know what the Cornish meant. Then we have Middle Cornish, where about 86% of the textual material comes from Middle Cornish. And it's all religious material, consisting of one poem, 5 mystery plays. These mystery plays were very similar in idea to the English mystery plays, the York mystery plays and the Chester mystery plays, but they're all in Cornish. And there are also 13 homilies. These are sermons which were written by Bishop Bonner in about 1554 during Queen Mary's reign when the country was Catholic, and he wrote these homilies and they were translated quite quickly, we think. It was done in a hurry by Tregear, John Tregear, for Catholics in Cornwall. And then we have late Cornish, where there is just one mystery play. Even that sometimes is classified as Middle Cornish, but as far as the date was concerned, 1611, it lies within this time bracket. It was realised by a group called the Newlyn School, not the Newlyn School of Art, that's quite a different Newlyn School, in the 18th century, that Cornish was likely to disappear. And so they went about writing as many articles, poems, stories, letters, translated, made lists of words in order to preserve, at least in written form, the Cornish which was around at that time. I have only 2 lines from one mystery play. This mystery play is Bunan's Kay, that is the life of St. Kay. St. Kay obviously was the patron saint of Kay down near Truro. And this play was discovered in 1999 in Wales. Many of the Cornish manuscripts found their way to Wales because presumably people found them and thought, oh, this looks like Old Welsh, we'll send it to Wales. And this one was found in the papers of a professor in Wales. And very exciting to find a new major text in Cornish in 1999. It's not easy to read. As you can see, this is the handwriting. It is typical of about the 1560s, so the handwriting experts tell us. And it is a copy. We know it's a copy because the scribe at one point writes in Latin, 4 pages have been cut out of my exemplar and I cannot copy them. So the beginning of this play is missing, the middle 4 pages are missing, and the last few pages are also missing. But there is still nearly 3,000 lines of it, which is a lot to study. And here we have written out these lines. Meagech barazo dres keel dres gwel dres prazo. And this is a sorceress speaking, and this is what it means. It's an interesting play because it has King Arthur in it. And that really excites the Arthurian supporters. It's part of the canon of Arthurian literature, if you like. This is something quite different. This is the last piece of Cornish that was ever written in 1776. I'll read a bit of it so you can hear what it may have sounded like. Blwch ddiw tregens y pam, therfi dyn brojec yn pasgas, Rig dasgi cronoac termin mevi mau. But it's the translation, what he's actually saying, which is quite poignant and remarkable. My age is 65. I'm a poor fisherman. I learnt Cornish at the time when I was a boy. I was at sea with my father and 5 more men in the boat. So this William Badinner was not a native Cornish speaker. He was a native English speaker, but he learnt Cornish from older men going to sea as a boy. I heard hardly one word of English spoken in the boat for a complete week. I have never seen a Cornish book. I learned Cornish going to sea with old men. There are no more than 4 or 5 in our village who can speak Cornish now, old people 80 years of age. Cornish is all forgotten by young people. It's pretty terrible, really, reading that. What would he have thought, however, to see that the language has actually been revived and there are people now speaking it? So I want to dwell on this decline of Cornish. Why did it decline? Why did it disappear nearly? Well, the first thing was the Protestant Reformation. Cornwall, like England for that matter, was Catholic in liturgy. Going to church, you would have the liturgy in Latin, Catholic liturgy, and the sermons in Cornish, for the most part, particularly in the West. And this would break links with Brittany. Up until the Reformation, Cornish and Breton were nearly mutually intelligible, and there was a lot of movement between the two. The legislation was passed to translate the Bible into both Welsh and Cornish, but only Welsh was carried out. It was carried out in 1584, before the King James Bible into English, though of course there was the Tyndale Bible in English. However, possibly the main reason was that English was seen as the language of social advancement. If you could speak English, you could get on. And here we have a stone commemorating the events of 1549. This is in Penrhyn. Hemagofhan col y golgi Glasneth and Mernans a Dilio a Wascaliorium Gernuic in Inns of Fendia ag a Ffydd, Yeth a Devosel Celtic. And the translation underneath, this commemorates the loss of Glasney College. Now, Glasney College was a Catholic seat of learning which suffered the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. And it is believed it is where the medieval mystery plays were written. It's quite interesting now, of course, that the Glasney College is very close to the site of the combined universities at Tremoe. And it also says the death of thousands of Cornish patriots in defence of their faith, language and Celtic customs. This really was a tremendous blow to the language. So apparently the mystery plays were on occasion performed even after the Reformation. Up to 1620 there are records of them having been performed, and the last one, The Creation of the World, dates from 1611. Then in 1676 we have two events which in a way are linked. The last sermon was preached in Cornish in that year, and it was the year of the death of the last Cornish monoglot. So after that, everyone knew English. So in a sense, there was no logical reason for the continued existence of Cornish. However, the Newlyn School that I've already mentioned saw that since everyone now knew English, there wasn't any particular reason for the continuation of Cornish. Then they set about recording as much Cornish as possible. And into their midst came Edward Hewitt, who was a polymath and Welsh speaker, but he learned all 6 Celtic languages. And he came to Cornwall. He also went to Brittany. In Brittany he was arrested as a spy and thrown into prison for 3 weeks. But he found that all the fellow prisoners were Breton speakers. So he had a whale of a time writing down and learning Breton from them. In Cornwall, he came to Cornwall in 1701 with some other recorders, some helpers, and he noted many, many words. he also knew of the mystery plays from the Middle Ages, and he wrote down words from them. But he didn't separate. These words come from the plays, and these words I have heard from local informants. They're all mixed up, and we cannot sometimes distinguish which are which. Neither did he record who his informants were. Anyone doing dialectal research now has to do this. You may have seen in the press this month that there is an idea to reproduce or have update the English dialect survey, which was done in the 1950s, and various universities, Leeds, Exeter for example, are sending people out to record people speaking dialect, English dialect. And they have to say they have to choose their informants very carefully. They should have lived in the same place all the time, and probably have their forebears as well living in the same place. And they record their age and a bit of their experience. Edward Stewart didn't do any of that. He recorded it, but we don't know who his informants were. And then in 1777, we have the death of Dolly Pentreath, said to be the last native Cornish speaker. She knew English as well, but Cornish was her native language. There may have been others later, but she is traditionally the last. Now we also have an element not just in time, but also in space. And the language retreated from east to west, so that in 1300, for example, the boundary is here, and the panhandle here was settled by Saxon settlers. Only about 5% of the place names in this area are Cornish. And then gradually, Cornish retreated to the west. 1600 here, 1650, 1700, 1750, and then in about 1800 it flew off the cliffs like our national bird, the chough, which has also been restored to Cornwall, of course. And in Scilly, interestingly, Cornish died out earlier than on the mainland. It died out in about 1660. And the reason for that is thought to be there are so many wrecks on Scilly that when people were rescued from a watery grave, they sometimes stayed on Scilly and married their rescuers. So there was a lot of intermarrying with English speakers. But there is a tradition. The place names on Scilly, some of them, a lot of them, are Cornish. But we've had great difficulty in getting people on Scilly to recognise that Cornish is part of their heritage as well as the mainland. Now, how many people spoke Cornish? Well, we can make estimates, and here we have an estimate. The number of Cornish speakers increasing, and then here, 1348, we have the Black Death, so we have a considerable drop off here, and then we reach a plateau of about 35,000. So apart from just before the Black Death, we've never had more than 35,000 people speaking Cornish. Not a great number. And as the language retreats from east to west, the total population of Cornwall increases, of course, but the number of Cornish speakers decreases. It's getting squeezed towards the west. And then by 1750, the number is so small that it doesn't appear on the graph. Well, how does the language die out? Well, it can die out. It can die out very quickly. It can die out in 75 years. Any language can be replaced by any other language in 75 years. Or any aspect of a language can be replaced by some other aspect in 75 years. If I go into a shop, I will say, have you got something? All young people say, do you have something? This is a change in English which has occurred in my lifetime, influenced by America, of course. A whole language can change like that. And the one which I'm most familiar with is Breton. So we'll look at Breton. In 1900, at least in the west of Brittany, almost everyone spoke Breton. So if we take one generation, the great-grandparents spoke only Breton. Then when we come to 1950, the parents who knew Breton, but they also knew French because they had learnt it, spoke only French to their children. So we then get children growing up who understand Breton, but they speak French. And then when they have children, they pass on only French to their children. So by the time we get to 2000, nearly all children in Brittany speak French, whereas in 1925, most of them in the West were speaking Breton. I can illustrate that with my wife. My wife is Breton, as many of you know, and she was in this generation when, in the 1950s, her parents, who were native Breton speakers, and their parents spoke only Breton, but they learnt French. My wife's parents learnt French at school. When my father-in-law went to school, he spoke only Breton. But he got told off if he spoke Breton at school. So he had to learn French. And then, when he had children, my wife and her brother and sister, they spoke only French to them. But they could understand Breton because the parents were using Breton as a language. If the parents didn't want the children to understand them, they would speak Breton. Of course, they did understand them. And then most people of my wife's generation did not speak Breton to their children. So it just dies out. Of course, in the case of my wife, she got interested in Breton. And so we spoke Breton to our children. So they speak Breton. And the same must have happened in Cornish. And you can date this. You can date the 1925 is about corresponds to about 1650. And eventually, by 1725, hardly anyone spoke Cornish. So it did persist, probably in families, in the far west, until about 1800. Right, I'll change the subject a little bit now and talk about place names, because people get interested in Cornish through place names. Most place names have two elements, but some have just one. These are places in Cornwall: Temple, Rock and Hat, with English place names. Some, Kay, I've already mentioned, it's a saint's name. Greek, down near Halford, is Cornish Greek, meaning a village. Hale is Hale, meaning an estuary. And Lugh, where I now live, is Loch, meaning a lake. It's the same word as Scottish loch. But most places have two elements. So, for example, in English, Oxford and Cambridge. And we have a lot of other places with forward as well. Dartford, Bedford, so on, so on. And one in Cornwall, Hessenford. Hessenford is an interesting name. people didn't realise what it meant for a long time, but it is an old English name. The Hessen means witches, of the witches. German Hexen. It means the ford of the witches, but it's an English name. And here, alongside Cambridge, we have Uxbridge, Stockbridge, Cowbridge, and a couple in Cornwall, Sladesbridge and Newbridge. We are all used to that. In those English place names, the first element describes the second. Oxford is a ford where oxen crossed, we presume. Cambridge is a bridge over the River Cam. So the second element is a generic, and the first element is qualifying the generic. And the qualifier is usually stressed and the generic usually unstressed. Oxford, Cambridge. You don't say Oxford or Cambridge. That would sound strange. Okay. Now in Cornish we can have two names with two elements as well. And you choose the same elements, bridge and ford. Bridge is pons, comes from the Latin pontem, because the Romans built much better bridges than the Celts. There must have been a Celtic word for bridge before, but I don't know what it is. And ford is ris. And when we look at names containing these two elements in Cornish, we notice that they're the other way round. The pons comes first, and the ris comes first. And here are some examples in Cornwall. So in Cornish place names, it's the first element that's the generic, the second element is the qualifier. But as in English, you stress the qualifier to say what sort of ford is it, what sort of bridge is it, because they're the other way round. So the stress in Cornish names is the other way round. So, some Cornish name. Penryn. Not Penryn, it's Penryn, as we know. But beware, I heard this morning, and I hear quite often people called Penrose, called Penrose, but it's not, it's Penrose, because it's the end of a promontory. Nelson is Lan Steven, the church site of Stephen. Bodmin, Bosvenna, house of monks. Lost Withiel, lost is a tail, Withiel is a wooded land, it means the tail end of wooded land. Penzance is Holy Headland, it's the same name as Holyhead in Anglesey. Redruth is Resruth, and Liscard is Lis and Keres, court of stags. Here are three which have a different form. These all have stress, have the qualifier second, but Camborne is the other way around for some reason, and Truro, curiously meaning triple boiling. Why should it mean triple boiling? Because three rivers converge there, and when they are in flood, that's exactly what you get. And Helston means an ancient court, Hellis in Cornish. And this idea that the stress is on the second syllable actually gets extended in speech in Cornish to places of purely English names. So for example, we have Liscard, which is correct because this bit is the qualifier. Liscard. If you hear people calling it Liscard, they're English.
Yeah.
Redruth, or just Druth, and Penzance. We're used to them, but also we find purely English names like Torpoint, Sordash, Wadebridge, where one would expect an English stress, but you don't get it. at least among Cornish people. Right, now a little bit about vocabulary. The parts of the body in any language tend to stick. They're the oldest part of the lexicon of any language. So it's not surprising that we find in Cornish the words for parts of the body here are very similar to those in the sister languages, Welsh and Breton. So if you know some Welsh or Breton, you will recognise that these are very similar. Pen for head, blew for hair, schools, shoulder, brech for arm, troes for foot. But interestingly, in Welsh the usual word for hand is llaw, and in Breton it's dorn. But in Cornish you find both of those in the text. And in Welsh the word for leg is coes, and in Breton it's gar, and in Cornish you find both. This one only once, but you do find it, coes and gar. Interesting. Quite a lot of words borrowed from Latin, particularly religious words, but also the words for the days of the week, which you see are borrowed from Latin, and they're very similar in all three languages, as you can see. But Cornish also borrows words from English, as one might expect. And here we have examples of some very common words in Cornish borrowed from English. So I'm going to ask you, I ought to ask you stuff before, but I'll ask you now, what is the difference between this set of words, the left-hand set, and the right-hand set? Right, well, the answer is that those on the right are borrowed originally from French. You can see these in French would be danser, hélas, grâce, loyal, certain, and sûr in modern French. Whereas these are borrowed from Old English. So Cornish has words from each original source. And if you're into phonetics, then here we have the sounds of Cornish and of Middle English. And you can see that the number of sounds in Cornish appears to be fewer than those in English. But in Cornish we have two sounds which did not occur in Middle English, at least not in later Middle English, and these are the U sound and the sound. They both occur in French and German, but clearly people learning Cornish have to firstly realise that there are sounds in Cornish that cannot be represented in English, and they have to learn how to make these sounds if they don't know French or German. And the consonants also are interesting, because here we have the set of consonants, and Cornish has far more consonants than English. In particular, there is a difference in Cornish between one M and two M's, and you don't get that in English. M, N, L and R, you can have different forms. For example, prena with one N means to buy, plenna with two N's means to bar a door, put a bar in front of it to lock it. So you have to be very careful whether you've got one N or two N's in Cornish. We also find that these phonemes, ch, sh and j, did not exist in Old Cornish. They were borrowed from English, so there were words which came in. into Cornish from English, and sounds also which came in. A little bit about word order. Linguists like to try to classify languages by the order of words in a statement. And they say, well, some languages are VSO, verb, subject, object, and others are VOS or SOV. And what we find in Cornish, it depends whether the statement is affirmative or negative. In an affirmative statement, it tends to be the same as English. Subject, verb, object. And gath, subject, whale, verb, and lagozan, object. The cat sees the mouse. But if you want to say the cat does not see the mouse, then it is ni whale, not sees, and gath, and lagozan. Yeah, you've got to get your head around that. It gets much more complicated. So it's not easy to classify Cornish as an SVO or VSO because it depends whether you're talking about a negative or an affirmative statement. Right, enough linguistics. Let's come on to the 19th century. The 19th century is very interesting because it's the time that Cornish is asleep until it's woken up like Sleeping Beauty by Henry Jenner. So we have two things going on in the 19th century. We have people who knew bits of Cornish, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, various sayings, they could count in Cornish. There were people counting in Cornish even into the 20th century. But at the same time, we have people starting to think about reviving it. We have the German philologists expressing an interest in Cornish. One of them actually composed 2 poems in Cornish in the 1850s. This, you might argue, was the first literature of the revival. Georg Sauerwein was his name. But you also had the general opinion of certain people like Davis Gilbert. No one more sincerely rejoices than I that Cornish has ceased altogether. They saw it as a barrier to social advancement. But eventually Henry Jenner, and others began to study the medieval plays, and Jenner began to compose poetry in Cornish. He worked for most of his working life in London, but when he retired, he came back to Cornwall and thought that it would be a good idea to revive Cornish, and he wrote a book here, his Handbook of the Cornish Language 1904, and conventionally we regard that as the start of the revival. And the language nearly died out in the First World War, but it got going again in the 1920s when Robert Morton Nance published a textbook, Cornish for All, and he worked with an Englishman, A.S.D. Smith, who published a textbook, Cornish Simplified, in 1934. So it was that time that people started to learn Cornish, but it was learned largely as a written medium. Now I'll say a little bit about the orthography of Cornish. You might think that the question was, if you have a language which died out, how do we know that we're speaking it correctly? And that indeed is a pertinent question which interested me. But what gets people much more annoyed is, are we writing it properly? And different people have different ideas as to how it should be written. Even during the traditional language, there were many different ways in which Cornish was written. And these were copied by people in more recent times. Jenner used a kind of mixture of middle and late forms. Nance tended to reject late Cornish and concentrate entirely on middle Cornish. Then in 1986, Canuit Kemming was introduced by myself, and this linked the spelling to the sounds much more closely because I had studied the sounds. It is a morphophonemic spelling. But not everyone accepted it. Nicholas Williams produced his own version, and Everson et al. Produced another one. And since 2008 we have had a standard written form which is phonetic rather than morphophonemic and political rather than linguistic. So here are some milestones in the revival of Cornish. The Cornish Language Board, of which I am the chairman, was formed in 1967 to oversee the development of Cornish. And we set examinations in the language at 4 different levels, which are going on until this day. This year we had about 85 people who passed exams at various levels. Cornish in 2003 was recognised under Part 2 of the European Charter, and this gave it quite a boost. It gave it some official recognition. And the translation of the Bible started in about 1996 and has now been completed. This was done by a team of translators, a few of which knew languages from the Bible. The coordinator, for example, knew Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, as well as Cornish, and Greek, so they were able to translate from the original languages straight into Cornish. Other people who did not know those languages had to proceed on a more circuitous route, but it is now complete. Not published as a book, it's online at the moment, or will be very soon. Right. We now come on to a song in Cornish. People write songs in Cornish, and people also translate songs in Cornish. This is something which interests me, translating popular songs into Cornish. And this one was written by Tanya Britton in Lou, all about rowing, as you can see. And perhaps Steve will play this one.
Any staff?
I did that some time ago, and it presented some interesting problems. The Cornish speakers here will know that the word for yesterday is de, and it doesn't really fit 3 syllables, so I had to seek another word, which I chose Sir Briggs,